Welcome back to Tony's Teaching Tips. Today's topic is scaffolding and zone of proximal development. I'm Tony Sindelar, a higher education instructional designer with many years of experience partnering with faculty and subject matter experts to create and improve teaching and learning. So today, we're going to start by talking about some education theory, specifically Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is often abbreviated ZPD. Lev Vygotsky was a psychologist, and he created this model represented by three circles. The center circle represents what a learner can do on their own. The outermost circle represents what is beyond the capabilities of the learner. And then the key part of the model is that middle circle, which represents what a learner can do with guidance. That middle circle is what Vygotsky labeled the zone of proximal development. Things you can't quite do yet, but can do with the right support. This was a very important development in educational psychology for establishing the social context of education. As instructors, you could consider our whole role is about creating that zone of proximal development by providing the appropriate activities, resources, and interactions that allow a student to go beyond what they can do alone to what they can do with the support you have provided. So what does it look like to actually do that? The concept of scaffolding, or instructional scaffolding, if you want to be clear, you're not talking about construction, is the act of providing support for learners to guide them toward success at difficult and challenging tasks. With scaffolding, we think about how we can provide structure that will support our students. I sometimes think of it as providing rungs on a ladder versus just hoping students can scale up a wall on their own. So, what would that actually look like in practice? When I talk about scaffolding with instructors who aren't familiar with the term, I often think back to a time early in my graduate school experience when I was asked to do a literature review. I was new to the field, and I did not know what a literature review was, or what differentiated a good literature review from a bad one, or how to go about creating a literature review for the first time. Unfortunately, the task I was given was simply write a literature review. It should be about 10 pages. That task seemed to operate from the assumption that all the learners being given it knew what a literature review entailed and could just do that. Now, in some places, it might be safe to make the assumption that students have previously worked through this idea earlier in that same course or previously in the curriculum, and we can just tell them to do the thing and they'll do the thing. But we all know assumptions can be dangerous. So as for me, in my scenario, I handed in something, but it was not great, and my grade reflected that. So what would it look like to scaffold that kind of assignment? First off, clear information about what the instructor is looking for in a literature review might be important. Even for students who've done literature reviews before, they might value in knowing what that instructor values in a literature review versus another instructor, because you may not value the same things. Next, and this is probably the most important step for thinking about scaffolding, take that big task, in this case, write a literature review, and break it into smaller steps. So if you were asking students to write a literature review, you might have them start by finding 10 relevant sources in the next few days. Then read through those sources and summarize them in notes. You might assign them to review a material specific to the citation style that they're going to need to do in that literature review. And then finally, as they're starting to draft and work on the writing of the literature review, where they're summarizing, synthesizing, and weaving together what the literature tells them about the topic they've either chosen or been assigned, you might ask them to share a draft with a classmate, get feedback, ideally in some kind of structured way where their students are given advice on what to look for in that feedback, and then give students time to revise before submitting that review for the final grade. So the important aspects of scaffolding here are providing resources, guidelines, and an opportunity to check in with other learners or the instructor. You'll see checking in with other learners, particularly in courses that are larger, where the instructor can't do as much one-on-one support for students along the way. This should lead to a better literature reviews or whatever assignment you're asking students to do, and ultimately an improved learning experience for your students. So that was just one example of scaffolding, and note that scaffolding will look different in different contexts. It might be appropriate and needed for learners in the first semester of a program, and then there are things later in the program where you can just ask them, do the thing that you've done before, or do this new thing, but look at how it connects to what we've done before. And of course, your learners' needs are different across a classroom full of students. What works for one student may not work for another. The challenge here with scaffolding is we're trying to do something that will, work for most students to support them in being successful with what their needs. So my challenge for you, consider how you would take a big thing that you ask students to do in whatever area you're involved in teaching, training, or instruction? And how would you break that into pieces? What kind of resources and supports would you provide? How would you help your students be more successful? How would you set them up for success? And how are you going to improve that learning experience for them? Now, I will admit, scaffolding is more work for an instructor. These are all things that you now need to do and decisions you need to make and communicate to your students. Not really much more work for the students, though they will probably appreciate the transparency in knowing what they need to do and not spend work on things that aren't helpful to getting to whatever goal you've attached to them. But I believe very strongly that scaffolding leads to improved learning and student success, and that it's worth that extra work. Learning is challenging. The key is assigning tasks that are challenging, but within that zone of proximal development, versus asking students to do things that are beyond what they are capable of doing, even with support and guidance. That's not setting them up for success. So that's all for now. I encourage you to think about what scaffolding will look like in your instruction and how you can do more with it. Bye.